Welcome to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. Today we're heading back to Anatolia to visit a famous empire we haven't talked about in a few weeks. That's right, we're going back to check on the Hittites as their young king Mursili II adds the kingdom of Arzawa to his growing empire at the Battle of the Astarpa River. Now this one's going to get a little crazy, because as often happens with the Bronze Age, we don't know a whole lot about this battle, but we have a lot of info around it. We've got a plague, an eclipse, even somebody getting hit with a meteorite. So get comfortable. This one's going to be a wild ride. Now the last time we visited the Hittites was back in 1595 BCE, when King Mursili I marched his army 800 miles down the Euphrates to sack Babylon, the wealthiest city in the world, just to show he could. And after he sacked Babylon, he headed home in triumph, only to be assassinated by his brother-in-law as soon as he returned. Well, it might not surprise you to learn that a kingdom that was that badass militarily and that big of a mess at home had pretty much the same borders almost 300 years later. It's the king we're talking about today, Mursili II, who's going to expand that empire out to its greatest extent by about 1300 BCE. And today's battle is one of the first in that expansion. So what do we know about Mursili II? Well, he left some pretty good records, especially for a Hittite king, but 3,300 years is a long damn time. It looks like he was never supposed to be king. His father, Suppiluliuma I, had at least 3 other sons. His oldest, Arnawanda II, was the one he groomed to rule. The next 2 he named governors of key provinces in the empire. He might have sent another one to Egypt as an ambassador to Pharaoh Akhenaten or Tutankhamun. Yes, King Tut himself. Or both. Maybe he sent him down there because somebody promised he could marry the pharaoh's widow and unite the kingdoms. And then the Egyptians killed him on the way down there, which would help explain some of the bad blood between Hattusa and Egypt between the 1320s and the 1270s BCE. And then there was Mursili. Not sure what Suppiluliuma had in mind for his youngest son, but it wasn't kingship. But the universe has a sense of humor, and the king got sick. An epidemic of what historians think was probably tularemia hit the Hittite Empire and many parts of the Middle East in about 1325 BCE. Assyria and Egypt managed to quarantine themselves, but in 1322, Suppiluliuma got sick and died, leaving the throne to his son Arnawanda II, who promptly got sick and died maybe 18 months later, which is how the throne came to Mursili. And to be honest, it was a shitty time for a young king to replace an experienced older king on the Hittite throne, because Suppiluliuma had spent a good bit of his reign beating back neighbors who wanted a piece of his kingdom, and it doesn't look like he had fully subdued any of them before he died. The Mitanni to the east, the Canaanites and Egyptians to the south, the Casca to the north, the Arzawans to the west, all of them had tried to take bites out of Hattusa in the half-century before Mursili II came to the throne in 1322 or 1321 BCE. So saving the Hittite Empire would fall to the new guy nobody had bothered to groom for kingship. And now, on top of everything else, an epidemic of tularemia was raging in his empire, making it look like the gods themselves wanted the Hittites to go away. But for all the finer points of kingship Suppiluliuma had failed to teach Mursili, he clearly taught him not to give up, because that was the lesson Mursili seems to have held on to for his entire reign. But before we get into that, we're going to nerd out for just a minute about dating. No, not how to get together with somebody. I'm old and married, and my advice about that wouldn't do you much good. I'm talking about how archaeologists and historians figure out when stuff happened, when the records we have don't give us dates that match up with dating systems we recognize. I mean, if the only record we have says such and such happened in the 10th year of the reign of so-and-so, and we don't know what year so-and-so took the throne, that doesn't help us much. But sometimes events happen that we can date with a little better certainty, and we can use those to anchor other events. Eclipses, comets, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, plagues. These kinds of things are often recorded by many different cultures, and we can compare the notes to line these cultures up with each other. And with an astronomical event like an eclipse, we can do even better, because we understand how eclipses happen, and we can calculate the orbits of the Earth around the Sun and the Moon around the Earth, and know not just the year but the date and time of day a particular area would have experienced an eclipse. Which means when an eclipse shows up in the records, it gives us a very good idea what was happening on that day. And as luck would have it, the Hittites recorded that in the 10th year of Mursili's reign, the sun gave a sign right before he launched a campaign into northeast Anatolia. We think the sign was an eclipse, and the most likely candidate is a total eclipse that would have crossed Anatolia in 1312 BCE, which means he came to power in about 1322 BCE. Of course, that eclipse is still 7 years in the future of today's battle, so it doesn't tell us much about the battle itself. I just think it's cool that we can use things like this to give us a better idea of when stuff happened. Okay, back to the battle. So one of the hostile kingdoms that had been doing its best to be an existential pain in the Hittites' ass was the kingdom of Arzawa. This kingdom took up about the southwestern quarter of the Anatolian peninsula, and it looks like there was a central kingdom called Arzawa, surrounded by other states that formed kind of a loose Arzawan confederation. In the 1370s, these guys had managed to conquer a good chunk of southern and western Hattusa, which had prompted the Hittites to actually move their capital up into the mountains to the city of Samuha for a few years. These victories inspired the Egyptians to establish direct relations with the Arzawa instead of going through the Hittites. Looks like for a while there the pharaohs smelled blood in the water. I haven't seen any evidence they actually armed the Arzawans or the Canaanites or the Mitanni, but they certainly seem to have encouraged their aggression against the Hittites. But Suppiluliuma had retaken most of the Arzawans' gains by the time he died, and made sure they understood their goat-smelling asses weren't getting anywhere near his people while he had anything to say about it. And then Suppiluliuma died. And then his son died. And his youngest son, barely even an adult, stepped into the kingship. Well, the Arzawan king Uhaziti figured this was a damn good time to throw his weight around. He wrote a letter to the new king, calling him a child and more or less telling him his daddy wasn't there to take care of things anymore. And he started gathering his forces, offering sanctuary to any rebels against Hittite rule, and encouraging the Hittites' neighbors to start making noise again now that Suppiluliuma, the great general, was gone. And in a pattern you'll probably recognize by now, many of them did. The Kaska, a mountain people who lived in the north side of Anatolia, were the first to rise up. These guys weren't as numerous or as united as the Arzawans, but they were big enough to be a significant threat to the Hittites, and they were a lot closer to Hattusa. Mursili would have to move against them first. So he started getting his troops ready, because for all his enemies shit-talking, Mursili wasn't a child. He was certainly old enough to take the throne in his own right, because we don't hear anything about a regent or one of his older brothers coming home to take the throne. Mursili was an unexpected king, but it doesn't look like anybody within the Hittite Empire was contesting his reign. We don't know how old a young Hittite had to be considered a man, or if that age was different from how old a king would have to be to rule without adult supervision. It's possible Mursili took the throne as a teen, but early 20s seems more likely to me. A young king, sure, but king in his own right. And his enemies had forgotten a very important fact about this young man they were talking shit about and encouraging revolt against. He may have been Suppiluliuma's youngest son, but he was still his son. And he wasn't about to just roll over and let some chuckleheads kill his people and take his shit. No shit. There they were. The BS meter for this story is about 8 out of 10. We have names and approximate dates, but I've had to make up most of the details. Mursili's first campaign was against the Casca to the north. These guys probably weren't an existential threat to the Hittite Empire the way the Mitanni or the Arzawa could have been, but they were the closest, and they were strong enough that they may actually have burned the city of Hattusa itself in the 1330s, which would have been a vivid memory for most of Mursili's generals and advisors, even if it wasn't for Mursili himself. Before they moved against the Arzawa or anybody else, they would have wanted to know the Casca couldn't threaten their rear. And Mursili was young and unproven, and king or not, he would have been under a lot of pressure to listen to his advisors. Of course, a mountain people like the Casca wouldn't have wanted to seek a decisive battle. The Hittites would have had too many advantages in that kind of warfare. For these folks, rebellion might have just meant refusing to pay tribute and keeping the Hittites from driving into their mountains and destroying their towns. Yes, they had shown their ability to come together as an army in the past, but my guess is they preferred to fight in small bands and raid for plunder and slaves. But Mursili had other problems. He didn't have time to go hunting through the mountains, and he needed the tribute and the troops the Casca could provide him if he could bring them back into the empire. They could hide from him in the mountains, but they couldn't hide their cities. So he just marched against the cities, burned them, and made the armies come to him. And this young kid who nobody respected promptly tore them a new asshole and drafted the survivors into his army. That took him 2 years. It's possible that during those 2 years he also invented biological warfare by sending a herd of tularemia-infected sheep to Arzawa, where they would have been captured and added to the Arzawan flocks. Because tularemia is one of those diseases that doesn't jump from human to human, but will jump from an animal to a human. And the infections that resulted from that herd of infected sheep may just have prevented the Arzawa from invading while Mursili's attention was on the Casca. And in year 3, he finally turned his attention to the Arzawa. Before he marched, he sent a message to Uhaziti. There were guys running from cities who owed troops to Mursili and going to Arzawa, and Mursili wanted them back. And there was the little matter of the letter Uhaziti had sent when Mursili took the throne. In a nutshell, Mursili's message was this: "Stand fast, motherfucker. I'm on my way." Well, Uhaziti wasn't worried. This was his chance to spank this kid who thought he was something special, and to get some payback from the fucking Hittites. But it looks like the gods had other plans. And this is the part of the story that sounds like bullshit, but it's in Mursili's records. As the Hittites were marching toward the Arzawan capital of Apis, the records say the Hittite god Tarhunas hurled a thunderbolt that passed over the Hittite army and struck Apis. The thunderbolt caught Uhaziti's knee, and he sickened. Modern historians, no shit, think a meteorite hit Apis and injured Uhaziti. Now, there is one documented case in history of somebody being hit by a meteorite in 1954, and she survived. So it's possible to be hit by a meteorite and not die. But just imagine the shit luck. It's no wonder everybody thought a god had done it. Of course, it could have been something else. He could have been struck by lightning, or caught in a landslide, or attacked by an animal. He could have come down sick with something. Or he could have just lost his nerve and made up an excuse. The story about the army seeing the thunderbolt could be entirely apocryphal, made up to explain something that seemed like it needed an explanation after the fact. Hell, even if it was a meteorite, it could have hit Apis, and he caught a hunk of shrapnel in his knee. It didn't have to be a direct hit. But it's a good story, and we're going to go with it. So, Uhaziti was laid up in bed by the wrath of the gods, and he sent his son, Piyama out to fight Mursili. And when he did that, Uhaziti had to shut his pie hole about how young Mursili was, because I can't find an age for Piyama, but I'm just going to imagine he was even younger than Mursili. So this kid marched his army out of Apis, but he didn't go directly to face Mursili. Instead, he made a stop at the kingdom of Mira, which I assume was a Hittite ally because he may have destroyed a city called Impa before confronting the army of Mira and getting his ass kicked. It's not clear why he would have done this, but it's possible that Mira was between Apisu's and Mursili's army, and Piyama felt like he needed to take them out first to keep them from maneuvering against his rear, kind of similar to what Mursili did against the Casca before he moved on Arzawa. But it looks like he miscalculated, or else he didn't know what he was doing, and managed to lose a fight his dad would have won. But whatever he was doing in Mira, he managed to keep his forces intact enough to head after Mursili next. They met at the Astarpa River, possibly at a city called Walma. We know Mursili won and Piyama escaped, but that's about it. So, let's make something up. Mursili had already heard about Piyama defeat from his allies in Mira, and he wasn't worried about facing him. After all, he was marching with 15,000 veteran Hittite warriors. How many could Arzawa have, especially after Mira mauled them? And without Uhazidi there to lead them, how hard would they be willing to fight? Piyama for his part, was doing his best to appear confident to his troops. But his officers had been around for a while, and they could see the little signs he tried to hide. But they had no particular reason to respect Mursili's abilities, and they were standing between the hated Hittites and their home. They were not going to let the king down whatever his son decided to do. So they started making suggestions, guiding Piyama to the decisions they wanted him to make. Mostly gentle nudges like, "If my lord would take my advice," and "Do you think we should?" And for the most part, he listened. And they managed to make it to the field where they wanted to fight before the Hittites could. A broad plain beside a bend in the Astarpa River, near the city of Walma. The prince knew from his scouts that Mursili would reach the spot the next day. So he spent the afternoon walking the field with his generals, planning where they would fight. He could anchor his left flank on the river and his right flank on the edge of the valley, leaving his own chariots just enough room to form up on his right. And he set the infantry on the left to dig in ditches across their front, which would force the heavy Hittite chariots to focus against his right, where his own chariots could counter him. And that evening, his preparations complete, he had his 10,000 men camp where they were so they could strike camp and immediately form up for battle in the morning. To avoid any unnecessary delays, he gave the order for the guys to have a hot meal in the evening, but not to take the time to cook anything in the morning. The soldiers grumbled about that, as soldiers will, but they ate their supper and kept it to themselves. And when they woke up in the morning, they struck camp and formed up just as they were ordered. When the Hittites arrived, they would be ready. Except the Hittites were already there, waiting under the trees at the far end of the valley. Mursili's scouts had already told him about the Arzawans' preparations, so he had marched his army late into the night to get him here. And now they rested in the shade while the Arzawans stood in the sun waiting for him. Around mid-morning, when he saw the Arzawans start getting restless, Mursili sent his chariots out to race around the field a couple of times, using the movement to start deploying his infantry, each man of whom got a good drink of water before he stepped out into the sun. The Hittites took their time forming up, letting their enemies bake in the sun while they kept their legs limber as they marched out into their formations. Finally, when the sun was full overhead, Mursili gave the order to attack. The infantry started forward from the right end of the Hittite line so they could hit the left end of the Arzawan line first. And when the Hittite infantry had cleared half the distance to their enemy, the Hittite chariots started forward. Now the Hittite chariots outnumbered the Arzawans by half again, and while the Arzawans had light 2-man chariots, the Hittites were just learning to field their heavier 3-man chariots. They were slower than the Arzawans, but more aggressive, and as the Arzawan chariots started forward, a third of the Hittites started loosing their arrows at them, while another third charged full speed at the Arzawan infantry. It was a risky move, but against the hungry and overheated Arzawa, it worked like a charm. Because as we've talked about before, a chariot isn't a great weapon for shock effect because the weapon system, the archer or the spearman, is behind the propulsion system. But that criticism ignores a fundamental truth. Humans don't like to stand in front of charging horses. Unless they are very well trained, they will usually move. And the Arzawa moved. The infantry threw themselves out of the way of the charging chariots, opening holes in the line that the third group of chariots now exploited, charging through the gaps into the Arzawans' rear. And the Hittite infantry, now making contact with the Arzawans' left, kept the infantry busy on that side so it couldn't help close up the holes on the right. Well, watching his line melt was not something Piyama Kurunta was prepared for. So as the Hittite chariots closed in, he told his driver to get the hell out of there. The rest of the Arzawa didn't wait around after that. As they watched their prince hauling ass away from the battlefield, they decided that was a pretty good idea. They had stood in line of battle, baking in the heat for half the day, waiting for a battle that was over in the time it took to eat a meal. The Hittites suffered 12 killed and 43 wounded, with another 13 horses killed. The Arzawans left 1,000 men dead on the field and in the pursuit. And with the prince escaped, his generals tried to rally the men, but without much luck. They had seen how easily the Hittites had cut them down, and their thoughts now were to get back to their families and try to stay alive. So 4 days later, Mursili and his army marched into Ephesus pretty much unopposed. He held the Arzawa capital now, but he hadn't really subdued the Arzawans yet. Uhaziti and his son had given him a good start, fleeing by ship into the Mediterranean, where Mursili couldn't follow. By the way, if this city Ephesus is sounding familiar to you, that's because you've probably heard of it. A few centuries after today's battle, it's going to be settled by Ionian Greeks, and its name will gradually shift to Ephesus. And when the early Christians start talking about what their religion is going to look like going forward, there's going to be a key community in Ephesus, and Paul is going to write letters to the Ephesians. But back to 1319 BCE. A few generals had managed to round up their troops, and these beat feet to 2 different locations. Some of them repeated up to the top of Mount Arinanda, and the others took shelter in the city of Paranda, gathering as many dudes as would still follow him to those places. Well, Mursili might just have given thanks to his gods for splitting his enemies up for him. He turned against the mountain first. It was a tough target. A mountain on an island overgrown with plenty of vegetation and few trails, and his chariots would be useless there. But his infantry encircled the mountain, cutting the Arzawa off from food and water. And sure enough, pretty soon they came crawling down begging for mercy. Mursili claimed to have taken more than 15,000 captives from Mount Arinanda. Next, he turned his attention to Paranda, the last major Arzawan city holding out against him. He laid siege to the city, but it got late in the year. Snow started falling, and he pulled his army back to the Astarpa to wait out the winter. And while he's waiting, this city, Paranda, will also be settled by Ionian Greeks in a few centuries, and its name will shift to Metropolis. I guess Superman wasn't there to save it from Mursili, though. During the winter, Uhaziti died in exile, and another of his sons, Tapalazunali, came to Paranda to try to organize the resistance. But when Mursili came back to resume his siege in the spring, Tapalazunali and his family took off again and left the city to the Hittites. The city didn't hold out much longer after that. Mursili claimed to have taken another 15,000 captives from Paranda. I get the sense that 15,000 was just a number that meant a shit ton to Mursili, or maybe to his scribes, and we probably shouldn't take it too literally. Anyway, Mursili now held Arzawa, and its last king was dead, and his sons were on their own to go off and plan their triumphant return, which never happened. After all, how many times do your people have to watch you abandon them before they decide maybe you're not worth following after all? And a few years later, Mursili would see an eclipse and take it as an omen to attack another neighbor. Can you blame him? This guy seems to have had some luck with celestial events. So we think Mursili II reigned for about 25 years, pushing the empire's borders out to their greatest extent around 1300 BCE. And succeeded in about 1295 BCE by his son Muwatalli II, who would go on to face Ramses II at the Battle of Kadesh. And if you're interested, you can find that battle at the link on the screen somewhere around here. Well, no scorecard this week, It's pretty clear Mursili II was a badass, but since we have to make up the details of the battle, it doesn't really make sense to evaluate his conduct of a battle I pulled out of my ass. But I have started using a new feature that'll give you an idea how much of today's war story I had to make up. And you heard me say it earlier, I'm calling it the BS meter until I come up with a better name for it. And in this case, the BS meter on this war story is about an 8 out of 10. That means it's about as accurate as a shotgun. We have names and approximate dates, but that's about it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this war story, please give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. If you'd like to leave a comment or ask a question, I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to tell your nerdy friends about me, especially the one that you just thought of when I said that. Till next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.